The Sheldon farm stood on a lonely stretch of New England soil, where the fields ran wide and the woods pressed close. From a distance it looked like any other homestead, its house weathered gray by years of wind and rain, its barn sagging yet upright, its fences crooked but still holding. To the few neighbors who passed along the dirt road, the family seemed plain and pious, quiet people who tended their land and bowed their heads in prayer. But even from afar, there was something about that place that did not rest right with the living. Birds flew differently over those fields, avoiding the trees near the house. Children walking past whispered that the soil gave off a smell not of earth but of rot, though no one could ever point to a carcass or explain why. Adults laughed it away, but their laughter sounded thin, like a shield against a truth they dared not confront. The Sheldons never welcomed visitors. A request for sugar, a need for seed, or the exchange of news was met with a smile that never touched the eyes and a door closed politely, firmly, with finality. Their children were rarely seen beyond the fence, and if a figure appeared in the fields, it vanished again before anyone could wave. When neighbors celebrated births, weddings, or funerals, the Sheldons remained absent, their pews at the church sitting empty year after year. Yet no one reported open hostility. The family's silence was not rebellion. It was as if they had cut a slit in the world and lived behind it in some pocket where time and law could not reach. Soon whispers began to gather like weeds. Births were never recorded in the county ledger, though cries of infants were sometimes carried on the wind. Deaths were never noted either, though smoke rose from the farm at odd hours of night, carrying an acrid tang that clung to the throats of those who breathed it. When census takers came, they were turned away with courtesy but without answers, told the patriarch was away or the children were asleep. The officials, weary from miles of travel and preferring peace over conflict, marked the page with guesses and moved on. In this way, the Sheldons drifted through decades without paper or proof, their lineage tied only to soil and shadow. To the surrounding community, it became easier to pretend they were harmless, a family of old ways and private faith. Farmers spoke of them in the tone one reserves for storms, something to be endured, not challenged. Still, a sense of unease crept in. Livestock on nearby farms sometimes went missing, leaving only trails that vanished at the edge of Sheldon land. Travelers who camped in the woods too close to the property told of hearing cries in the night, thin and childlike, only to find nothing when they searched. Most brushed it off as imagination, but some swore the voices carried not pain but ceremony, like chants half swallowed by earth. The farm itself seemed to resist change. While other families struggled with drought or flood, the Sheldons' crops grew tall, though the stalks bent in unnatural ways, curling toward the farmhouse instead of the sun. Their livestock, when glimpsed, looked healthy yet strange, as if bred for some hidden trait no one could name. Over the years, rumors spread that their fields were fertilized with more than manure, that the soil held bones instead of stone. No one tested it because no one dared step past the fence uninvited. Fear was not spoken, but it was shared in every glance when the name was mentioned. Behind closed doors, the Sheldons cultivated a reputation of innocence. The father, Abel Sheldon, was often seen in town once or twice a season, trading grain or buying tools, his manner calm and respectful. He bowed his head in prayer at the general store before handing over coins, his words soft, his smile quick. But when he returned to his farm, the mask slipped. There, on the land no law had touched, he presided not as a farmer, but as a keeper of rituals too old and cruel to belong in any church. His family lived under a doctrine written not in scripture, but in scarred wood and hidden blood. The secrecy of births was not neglect, but design. Each child born into the family was stripped of identity before their first breath, their existence sealed within the walls of the house. No midwife ever left alive with the memory of their cries. No doctor was summoned to mark their weight or health. The act of bringing life was treated as an experiment, the child not a son or daughter, but a vessel to be shaped. To the outside world they did not exist. To the inside world they existed too much, burdened with meaning too heavy for small shoulders. Those who passed the farm at night sometimes saw lights moving in patterns that no lantern could make. A glow would pulse and fade, then return in rhythm as if marking time. Dogs barked and refused to move closer, their hair bristling until their masters pulled them away. The land became an unspoken border. No games played near it, no hunts pursued through it, no footsteps on its soil unless forced. And yet the Sheldons themselves moved among the townsfolk without fear, their faces ordinary, their hands steady. Evil wore a mask of normalcy, and the mask was so carefully placed that few dared to question what lay beneath. In time, generations passed, and still the family remained rooted in the same land, untouched by war or plague or poverty. It was as if time curved around them, skipping their names in every ledger, their faces in every photograph. To the world, the Sheldons barely existed, but to the soil beneath their farm, they were everything. That earth had drunk too much of their blood and borne too many of their secrets to ever be ordinary again. And so the farm endured, the house standing like a scar on the landscape, familiar yet wrong. It was a place where silence grew heavy and time itself seemed to pause. To anyone looking from outside, the Sheldons were simply private people. To those who looked too long, they were something worse. An entire lineage living just out of reach of law and memory, shaping a world of their own, where cruelty could thrive without witness. And beneath the fields, in soil damp with things never spoken, the first century of their secret had already been written, waiting for the day when the earth itself could no longer keep it hidden. Inside the Sheldon farmhouse, life unfolded in ways no outsider could imagine. The walls that looked weathered and ordinary from the road enclosed a world of silence and control, a place where children entered existence without the dignity of being seen. Each child was born into secrecy, delivered not into a family but into an experiment, their cries muffled before they could echo beyond the wooden beams. No name was spoken over them, no baptism performed, no record written. They were not sons or daughters in the eyes of the world. They were shadows, stripped of identity before they had even learned to breathe. The absence of names was not a careless neglect, but a deliberate choice. Abel Sheldon and the patriarchs who followed him believed that to name a child was to give it freedom. A name meant recognition, a place in society, a voice that might someday call for help. By erasing that step, the Sheldons sealed their children into a kind of living void, bound only to the family and its twisted order. Within the walls of the farmhouse, a child's worth was not measured in love but in usefulness, in how well they obeyed, in how much pain they could endure without breaking. To the patriarch, children were not blessings. They were raw clay, material to be shaped through ritual and cruelty into vessels of silence. The daily rhythm of childhood on the farm was grim and mechanical. At dawn, the children were roused by the clanging of iron against stone, a sound that served as both alarm and command. They were herded into narrow rooms, their bare feet pressed against cold floors. Meals were sparse and joyless, bowls of bitter broth or dry bread rationed not for nourishment, but for obedience. Hunger was part of the design. It dulled their spirits, made them pliable, carved them into bodies that listened more than they spoke. Any word uttered without permission earned swift punishment, not with a slap or a belt, but with methods devised to scar deeper than flesh. Some were forced to kneel for hours on grains of dried corn until their skin split and bled. Others were made to hold heavy stones above their heads until their arms shook and collapsed, and when the stone fell, the punishment began again. Play, if it could be called that, was another form of control. Instead of toys, the children were given tools, ropes to knot and unknot until their fingers bled, iron weights to carry in silence, scraps of wood carved into shapes that resembled nothing but cruelty. A favorite game of the patriarch was the trial of stillness, where children were made to sit perfectly, silent for hours while insects were placed on their skin, crawling across faces and burrowing into hair. To move or cry out was to fail, and failure was met with isolation in a pitch-black cellar that smelled of damp soil and old blood. The patriarch called it teaching endurance, but it was something darker, a way of molding fear into obedience, of turning children into instruments rather than people. As they grew, the children learned the unspoken truth. Their existence was not for themselves. They were not raised to dream or to hope, but to participate in rituals whose meanings they were too young to grasp. At night, they were led into the chamber below the house, their small bodies lined against walls etched with symbols. They watched as animals were sacrificed in precise mechanical ways, their deaths measured out in time and breath, the patriarch's hands moving with the precision of a surgeon and the devotion of a priest. The children were made to observe, sometimes to assist, their tiny hands guiding blades or holding bowls. What should have scarred them instead bound them tighter, for they were taught that this was the purpose of life, to witness suffering, to become numb to it, to participate without question. Some of the older children resisted at first. They whispered among themselves, trying to imagine a world beyond the farm, a world where children had names and mothers smiled. But resistance was crushed quickly. Those who spoke of escape were broken in methods too chilling to describe fully, forced to endure hours of simulated drowning, revived and drowned again until their will collapsed, or strapped in contraptions that bent their limbs backward until joints screamed. These were not punishments, but demonstrations, lessons to the others about the futility of defiance. Afterward, the rebellious child returned to the group hollow-eyed, their voice quiet forever. The mothers in the house carried silent grief, watching their children suffer, yet powerless to intervene. They too lived under the same doctrine, their bodies treated as vessels for producing new subjects rather than partners in family. Their tears were wiped away by threats, their love smothered by fear. Some whispered lullabies in the dark, trying to slip fragments of humanity into their children's ears. But even those small acts carried risk. The patriarch believed affection bred weakness, and weakness was not tolerated. Love, when discovered, was punished with separation. Mother and child divided, each made to suffer alone. Both taught that connection was dangerous. The cruelty of the Sheldons was not wild or impulsive. It was calculated, a design passed down through generations. Every act of control, every punishment, every ritual was part of a system meant to strip away individuality and bind each child into the family's macabre legacy. The children's silence was not natural. It was engineered, cultivated like a crop. And over time, silence became their language, the only way they knew to survive. From the outside, nothing of this could be seen. Neighbors who glimpsed the children from a distance thought them shy or peculiar, their lowered heads mistaken for humility. No one suspected the machinery of cruelty grinding within those walls. No one imagined that each child they passed, nameless and faceless, carried scars etched not just on their bodies but on their souls. The Sheldon children were ghosts long before they died. Souls erased at birth, molded into shadows, their lives consumed by a family doctrine that valued control over compassion, silence over speech, ritual over love. And in that farmhouse the doctrine thrived, growing stronger with each generation, preparing the way for horrors still hidden beneath the floorboards, waiting to surface when the children became the keepers of the same cruel system that had devoured them. Beneath the creaking boards of the farmhouse lay a place no sunlight had ever touched. At first glance it was nothing more than a cellar, its entrance hidden beneath a false wall and reached only by a narrow stair cut into the stone. But to step inside was to enter a chamber of obsession, carved not for storage or shelter but for ritual. The walls were damp, yet they bore markings etched with deliberate care, lines, circles, and spirals drawn so deep into the stone that fingertips bled when tracing them. No one could say where the symbols came from, whether stolen from half-remembered scripture or born of Abel Sheldon's fevered imagination. What mattered was how they were used. This was not a space of chaos. It was a place of order, a theater where cruelty became doctrine and human suffering was rehearsed like sacred liturgy. The chamber smelled of iron and mildew, a mixture of old blood and damp earth that never faded no matter how much straw was scattered on the floor. Lanterns hung from rusted hooks, their flames flickering against jars lined neatly along shelves. Each jar contained something suspended in cloudy liquid, tiny bones, fragments of flesh, preserved organs labeled not with names but with symbols. To the Sheldons, these jars were not trophies but records, proof of a system carried out with precision. Every death, every dissection, every act of torment was catalogued, not for medicine, not for study, but for worship. It was in this place that disobedience was judged. To a stranger, a child's lie or refusal might warrant a scolding, but to the patriarch, such acts were signs of impurity, defects in the vessel that required correction or elimination. Victims were brought below under the guise of discipline, but what awaited was far beyond punishment. They were stripped of identity entirely, reduced to specimens whose agony could be charted, measured, and drawn into patterns. Cruelty here was methodical. It followed rules, each act of violence justified not in anger but in doctrine. To kill was not enough. It had to be done in stages with purpose, with meaning carved into every gasp and spasm. One favored ritual was called the severance. A disobedient child, or sometimes even a grown family member deemed unfit, was laid on a wooden slab bolted to the floor. Their wrists and ankles were bound not with rope but with iron cuffs that allowed no give, no chance of wriggling free. The patriarch would begin by placing a blindfold across the victim's eyes, not to spare them terror but to sharpen their other senses. Then came the first cut, not deep enough to kill but shallow and precise, tracing along veins and muscles, forcing the body into a state of constant bleeding without release. The goal was not death but endurance, to keep the subject alive long enough for the ritual to be completed. Prayers were spoken in whispers, but they sounded less like devotion and more like commands, words meant to strip away humanity until only a specimen remained. Others were made into examples of failed vessels. They were placed in a crude chair rigged with clamps and levers, a device that allowed the patriarch to manipulate the body into impossible postures. Limbs were bent backward and locked, ribs compressed until breath came in shallow gasps. The victim became a diagram of torment, their body reshaped into angles that mirrored the very symbols carved into the chamber walls. These contortions were not done in haste. They were adjusted slowly, inch by inch, while the patriarch murmured as if conducting an experiment. Pain was not the byproduct. It was the offering, the essential ingredient in a ritual that blurred science and sacrament. The chamber also bore evidence of experiments that ventured beyond flesh. In one corner stood a wooden table blackened with scorch marks. It was here that fire was applied not to destroy but to transform, tongues of flame directed with chilling patience across skin, muscles, and hair until the subject's screams broke into silence. But just as silence arrived, the patriarch would douse the flames, revive what was left, and begin again. To an ordinary mind, this was sadism. To the Sheldon doctrine, it was purification, a cycle of breaking and reviving that was believed to cleanse the vessel of weakness until nothing remained but submission. The children of the family were made to witness these ceremonies, standing in lines against the walls, their eyes wide and unblinking. Some were told to assist, passing tools, wiping blood, recording the time of each convulsion in a ledger. The act of witnessing was itself a ritual, binding them deeper into the doctrine, forcing them to see cruelty not as horror but as necessity. Their young minds learned quickly that survival meant silence, obedience, and complicity. To resist was to become the next specimen laid upon the slab. What haunted the chamber most was not the screams but the quiet that followed. After the rituals ended, the body was either buried beneath the fields or disassembled into parts for preservation. The chamber would be cleaned with water drawn from the well, the stains scrubbed until the stone gleamed faintly in the lantern light. Order was restored. Silence returned, and the family climbed the stairs again, stepping back into the house as if nothing had happened. Upstairs, they ate supper in calm voices, children chewing bread with lips still trembling, mothers bowing their heads. The patriarch speaking grace with steady hands. Normalcy wore its mask once more, while beneath the floorboards lay the residue of another life erased. The chamber did not serve only for punishment. It was the heartbeat of the Sheldon farm, the hidden altar on which their legacy was built. Each generation inherited not just the land, but the rituals carved into stone, the methods preserved in ledgers and jars, the doctrine that cruelty was not cruelty but purpose. And as each patriarch added new symbols to the walls, the chamber grew heavier with meaning, a place where time itself seemed to bend around the echo of suffering. Above ground, neighbors still saw only a quiet family, fields of corn swaying gently in the wind. But below, in that hidden room of symbols and blood, the truth lived on. The chamber was no accident, no temporary madness. It was the structure that defined the family, the secret that bound them together. And in its cold silence, each ritual written in pain carried the legacy forward, preparing the next generation to continue the cycle of cruelty masked as devotion. The weight of the Sheldons' legacy pressed hardest on the women. In that farmhouse, motherhood was not a gift, but a sentence. Each pregnancy treated less as life unfolding and more as a trial to be monitored, measured, and controlled. The patriarch watched closely, recording changes in the mothers' bodies with the same detached precision he used when cataloging jars in the chamber below. Their swollen bellies were not signs of hope, but experiments in progress, vessels carrying children destined not for freedom, but for the doctrine of obedience. The women were expected to endure silently, their pain regarded not with sympathy but with clinical fascination, as if each contraction, each cry, each tear was simply data in a ritual too cruel to name. Inside the house, mothers moved like ghosts, carrying both the weight of their unborn children and the terror of what awaited after birth. They were denied the comfort of midwives, denied the gentle hands of sisters or friends. Instead, their labors were overseen by the patriarch and sometimes by the older sons, who observed with cold detachment, learning not compassion but technique. Mothers were forced to give birth on hard boards instead of beds, their cries muffled by cloths pressed over their mouths. The moment of delivery was not greeted with joy but with silence, as if noise itself could undo the ritual. Once the infant emerged, it was whisked away into darkness before the mother could even see its face. She was left bleeding and gasping, her body emptied, her spirit broken, while the men debated the child's fitness in the chamber below. For some women, survival ended with childbirth. There were whispers within the family that not all mothers lived to see their children grow. Some were said to have been taken into the fields, their bodies lowered into shallow pits dug under the cover of night, their mouths filled with soil so their last cries would never escape. These burials were not marked with stones or crosses. They were hidden erasures, acts of disappearance carried out with a chilling efficiency that left no trace for the world beyond the farm. When neighbors asked why a familiar face was no longer seen, the patriarch would reply simply that she had fallen ill, or that she was away visiting kin. Few questioned it, and those who did were met with polite smiles that closed conversation. Those mothers who survived lived under a different kind of silence. Their grief became a private torment, smothered beneath obedience and fear. They learned quickly that to love openly was dangerous. A whispered lullaby, a lingering touch, or a protective word spoken too boldly could bring punishment upon both mother and child. Affection was treated as weakness, something that could corrupt the doctrine. When discovered, mothers were separated from their infants, sometimes for days, sometimes forever. The patriarch believed that by severing bonds he was strengthening the family. In truth, he was hollowing it out, stripping it of humanity until only ritual remained. The cruelty reached deeper than control. It was designed to erase identity. Some women were forbidden to use their own names once they married into the family. They were called only by titles: mother, wife, vessel. Their past lives were swallowed by the farm, their stories lost in silence. Letters they once wrote to relatives were burned. Memories of childhood homes faded into shadows. Even their reflections in mirrors were stolen as the patriarch removed mirrors from the house, declaring them tools of vanity. In this way, the women became faceless, nameless presences, existing only to bear children into the cycle of ritual and cruelty. Occasionally, the pressure became too much. A mother might weep openly, her sobs echoing through the thin walls of the farmhouse. But even grief was policed. She would be dragged below into the chamber, forced to kneel in front of the symbols carved into stone. The patriarch would remind her that her body was a tool, her tears a sign of rebellion. Punishments followed. Days without food, confinement in the dark cellar, sometimes worse. The lesson was clear. Silence was survival. And so the women learned to bury their grief, their mouths closed even as their hearts withered. The cruelty extended into the next generation, for daughters who grew within the household were groomed from childhood for the same fate. They learned to keep their heads lowered, their hands folded, their thoughts hidden. By the time they reached womanhood, they understood their bodies would never be their own. Marriage was not a choice. It was a passage into further servitude, whether to a Sheldon patriarch or to the doctrine itself. The cycle ensured that silence bred silence, generation after generation. To the outside world, none of this was visible. Neighbors saw women hanging laundry in the yard or tending to gardens, their faces calm, their movements steady. They looked like any other wives and mothers of the countryside. Yet beneath that calm surface lay unspoken suffering, grief too dangerous to share, and a fear so deep it seemed carved into their very bones. The silence of the mothers was not natural. It was forced, engineered through years of terror and ritual, until it became part of their very breath. The house above stood quiet, but beneath its stillness an entire history of erased voices lingered. Each vanished mother, each silenced lullaby, each buried affection became another stone in the weight pressing down on the family. And though the world outside went on unaware, the silence grew heavier with each passing year. A silence that would one day echo louder than screams. The chamber below the Sheldon farmhouse was not only a place of punishment, it was an altar where the patriarch perfected his doctrine of death. Over years, he built a system of killings that combined ritual with precision, cruelty with calculation, turning murder into ceremony. To him, death was not a sudden act, but a slow unraveling, a process to be measured in stages. Life was extracted in increments, each gasp and tremor treated as if it carried meaning. Victims were not simply executed. They were dismantled carefully, their suffering prolonged until it became more than pain. It became data, proof that the doctrine held power over flesh and breath. One of the patriarch's most chilling inventions was a practice he called the taking of breath. Victims were placed in a sealed chamber made from wood and iron, a space small enough to crouch in but never to stand. A mixture of herbs and burning oils was released inside, thick smoke that clawed at the lungs and blinded the eyes. The victim would gasp, choke, and collapse, their chest rising and falling in frantic rhythm as oxygen drained from their body. Yet just before the final stillness, the patriarch would intervene, dragging them out, pressing cold water to their lips, forcing breath back into their body. The revival was not mercy, it was preparation. Once the victim began to breathe again, the ritual started anew. In this way, the body was forced to die and return again and again until resistance broke and the victim's will dissolved into nothing. After the cycles of suffocation came the ritual of blood. The patriarch treated blood not only as life's essence, but as a language. He believed each vein, each artery carried meaning, and by cutting them in a precise order, he could map the soul's surrender. Victims were strapped onto the slab, wrists and ankles bound in iron cuffs, their skin washed as if in preparation for holy ceremony. Then came the blade, drawn not across the throat or chest in crude violence, but in careful patterns. A shallow cut at the wrist, just enough to let the blood flow in controlled streams. The patriarch measured the rate of loss, timing each drop as if it were a ticking clock. When weakness set in, he would halt the bleeding, cauterizing the wound with heated iron. Revived but not released, the victim was then cut again, this time at the thigh, then at the shoulder, each wound chosen not at random but with method, as if the body itself were a diagram waiting to be read. The chamber walls bore silent witness to these rituals, their stones stained dark in places that no scrubbing could erase. The patriarch believed that the suffering etched into those walls gave the chamber power, that the air itself carried the weight of past offerings. He kept ledgers where every ritual was recorded, dates, times, the sequence of cuts, the number of breaths taken before collapse. The handwriting was steady, almost elegant, each letter shaped with care, as if he were recording farm yields rather than human agony. These books were not hidden in shame. They were preserved with reverence, meant to be passed down like sacred scripture to future heirs who would continue the work. The victims varied. Sometimes they were children of the household who had faltered, deemed unfit for the doctrine. Other times they were outsiders who had wandered too close to the farm. Their disappearance never noticed beyond a passing whisper in town. Each victim, whether kin or stranger, was reduced to the same role. A vessel to be emptied in stages, a specimen in a ritual that blurred the line between science and sacrifice. To the patriarch, there was no distinction between family and stranger, between child and adult. All life was clay, all breath a resource to be spent. For the children forced to witness, the rituals carved deep scars. They stood at the edges of the chamber, their eyes locked on the victims, their small hands sometimes ordered to hold bowls that caught the blood. They learned that life could be stretched thin, that death was not a single end but a process repeated until the body surrendered piece by piece. Their silence was not only fear but training, each ritual binding them tighter to the doctrine. Some vomited in secret, their stomachs revolting against the horror, but even that was punished. Weakness could not be allowed. In time, even their revulsion dulled until they stared with blank faces, their humanity stripped away drop by drop, much like the blood they watched fall to the floor. There were moments when the patriarch seemed almost tender, stroking a victim's hair or whispering as they gasped for breath. Yet even this tenderness was twisted, for it carried no compassion, only control. His voice soothed not to comfort, but to remind them that their suffering was chosen, directed, purposeful. He saw himself not as a killer, but as a conductor, orchestrating the body's collapse with precision. To him, the gasps, the screams, the shudders were not signs of torment, but hymns of devotion, proof that his doctrine held dominion over flesh and spirit alike. Outside the farmhouse, the world went on in ignorance. Neighbors plowed their fields, children played in the sun, church bells rang across the valley. No one knew that beneath the Sheldon home, breath and blood were turned into offerings, that death was broken apart into stages and stitched into ledgers as if it were a harvest. The evil thrived not in the open, but in silence, hidden beneath the mask of a quiet, hard-working family. And in that silence the rituals grew more refined, more precise, each one another step in a legacy designed not only to kill, but to erase the very boundary between cruelty and worship. Evil within the Sheldon farm was not a sudden madness bound to one man. It was a lineage passed down like land or seed, each generation inheriting not only the soil but the doctrine carved into the chamber walls. Sons were raised beside rituals, their childhood lessons not written in books but inscribed in blood and breath. By the time they came of age, cruelty was not shocking to them. It was expected, a responsibility carried forward. The first patriarch, Abel, had planted the roots of ritual, but his heirs cultivated it into something darker, reshaping it with each generation, expanding its boundaries as though cruelty itself were a family trade. The sons did not question the rituals they inherited. To question would have meant weakness, and weakness was not tolerated. Instead, they competed in their cruelty, adding inventions to the doctrine, seeking new ways to break bodies while preserving life long enough to study suffering in layers. One heir devised a practice that silenced disobedience in the most permanent way: the weighting of tongues. Victims, often children within the family, were forced to extend their tongues as molten lead was dripped onto small iron weights. The cooling metal hardened into anchors, pulling tongues downward, splitting flesh and searing nerves. The patriarch taught his sons to watch carefully, to observe how long the body convulsed and how quickly the victim's voice dissolved into muffled sobs. To silence the tongue was to silence rebellion, and silence became the most valuable inheritance of all. Another heir turned his focus to the heart, believing that control of the body's core rhythm was the highest proof of dominion. He fashioned crude devices from copper wire and hand-cranked magnets, building contraptions that sent jolts of electricity into the chest. Victims were strapped down as sparks leapt across their skin, their muscles snapping taut, their eyes bulging with terror. The patriarch's son would stop the heart with repeated shocks. Then force, revival through pounding fists or cold water poured over the face. To him it was not enough to end life. True mastery meant holding it suspended, extinguishing and reigniting it at will. He recorded each revival as though charting the seasons, convinced that by commanding the heart he was approaching something close to godhood. The chamber became a workshop for invention. Wooden frames were constructed to bend spines into sharp arches, breaking vertebrae slowly rather than snapping them at once. Iron clasps were fitted to joints, twisting arms and legs until bones splintered, then setting the broken bodies into poses that matched the carved symbols on the walls. Victims became diagrams of pain, their contorted shapes arranged like offerings, their suffering transformed into geometry. What might have seemed monstrous to the outside world became, within the Sheldons, a form of art, an evolution of cruelty that grew more intricate with each generation. As fathers aged, their sons stepped forward, eager to prove themselves worthy heirs. To kill was not enough. Invention was required. Each son sought to leave his mark in new methods, passing them down in ledgers inked with neat handwriting, preserving not only the act but the theory behind it. Some wrote of the need to balance heat and cold, freezing skin until it cracked, then scalding it with boiling water to measure endurance. Others recorded experiments with deprivation, locking victims in pitch-black boxes for days, then unleashing sudden bursts of sound and light to fracture their minds. The doctrine of cruelty was no longer only ritual. It was evolving into a science of torment, refined generation after generation, perfected in silence behind farmhouse walls. The women bore witness to these changes, powerless against the tide of inherited violence. Sons they had carried and nursed became architects of suffering, their boyish innocence burned away in the chamber's lantern light. Mothers sometimes tried to whisper warnings, to plant seeds of doubt, but the doctrine was stronger than love. Fathers made sure of it, bringing boys into the chamber as soon as they could walk, forcing them to watch, to hold tools, to participate. By the time a son reached manhood, cruelty was no longer foreign. It was a second language, a way of life. The outside world continued its quiet ignorance. The Sheldons kept to themselves, their appearances in town unremarkable, their faces ordinary. A son might be seen at the market bowing politely, trading grain. No one imagined that the same hands which weighed apples had also poured molten lead onto a cousin's tongue or stopped a beating heart with sparks. Evil did not reveal itself in sneers or threats. It lived in calm smiles and steady voices, in men who looked no different from their neighbors. That normalcy was the greatest shield of all. By the third and fourth generations, the rituals had grown so detailed that cruelty was treated like inheritance, law, a set of rules to be obeyed with reverence. The chamber became more than a place of punishment. It was a family archive, each symbol carved deeper, each ledger entry added with precision. The Sheldons no longer needed to invent new rituals for survival. They invented them for legacy. To them, cruelty was progress, each method a refinement of those who came before. And like farmers tending crops, they cultivated pain carefully, ensuring that the doctrine would grow even after their deaths. What emerged was a cycle too powerful to break. Sons inherited not just land, but the mindset that life existed to be dissected, that cruelty was not cruelty but duty. And with each generation the methods grew bolder, stranger, more unthinkable. The chamber below was no longer just hidden beneath the floorboards. It was rooted in the blood of every descendant, carried forward like a seed that ensured the soil of the farm would never know peace. The Sheldon farm stood on the edge of the valley like a shadow cast across the land. To those who lived nearby, it was a place to be passed quickly, eyes fixed forward, breath held until distance brought safety again. Neighbors whispered of strangeness but rarely spoke it aloud. They told themselves it was only imagination, the mind playing tricks in the dark, yet each year brought new glimpses of something that stirred unease. Faint cracks in the mask of normalcy the Sheldons wore so carefully. On some nights, lights pulsed across their fields, not the steady glow of lanterns, but movements too rhythmic, too deliberate, like signals exchanged with the sky. The glow came in patterns, rising and falling, sometimes drifting across the crops as if guided by invisible hands. Those who saw it swore the light was alive, burning with a color not found in fire, too pale and cold to be natural. Farmers returning late from the market would stop on the road staring, then urge their horses forward, convincing themselves it was nothing but tricks of mist and moonlight. Yet the memory lingered, crawling under their skin long after the fields disappeared behind them. Other nights carried different signs. From the barn came sounds that made blood run cold. Screams muffled so deep they seemed half swallowed by earth. They began like the wails of animals in pain, but soon sharpened into tones that could not be mistaken for anything but human. The cries never lasted long. They cut off suddenly, leaving silence so complete it pressed on the ears. Neighbors lying awake in their beds stared at the ceiling, pretending not to hear, telling themselves that what carried on the wind could not possibly be real. To speak of it aloud would make it undeniable, and denial was safer than truth. Smoke was another messenger. From the farmhouse chimney rose plumes that did not smell of pine or oak, but of something thicker, bitter, clinging. The odor carried through the valley, acrid and metallic, a stench that coated tongues and lingered in throats. Some said it smelled of flesh, though no one dared confirm it. The Sheldons would appear at market soon after, their clothes clean, their faces calm, selling grain or trading livestock as if nothing had passed. The contrast made the unease worse. To see them smiling in daylight while the night whispered of horror was a dissonance no one could bear to confront. Fear was the first barrier that kept neighbors silent. The Sheldons were not aggressive, yet there was an aura about them, a heaviness that warned others to stay away. Respect played its part too. The family had worked the same soil for generations, surviving hardships that broke other farmers. Droughts, floods, and disease seemed to pass over their land, leaving their fields green when others withered. Some took it as proof of blessing, others as proof of curse, but either way it made the Sheldons untouchable. Superstition did the rest. People spoke in hushed tones of bargains struck in secret, of old pacts tied to the earth. No one wanted to be the one who tested such tales and found them true. There were attempts, small and half-hearted, to peer closer. A group of boys once dared each other to creep through the woods and watch the farmhouse by moonlight. They returned pale and shaking, claiming they had seen figures in the field standing in a circle, moving in unison without sound. The boys swore the figures turned their heads together as if aware of being watched, and the fear drove them running. Another time, a traveler lodging in the valley spoke of seeing a child near the Sheldon fence. The child's face was blank, their eyes wide and unblinking, their mouth opening soundlessly before they slipped back into the shadows. The traveler left at dawn and never returned. Each story added weight to the silence, yet no one confronted the family. To accuse would mean responsibility, and responsibility meant danger. Easier to pretend that the screams were only coyotes, that the lights were swamp fire, that the smoke came from foul wood. Easier to accept the mask the Sheldons wore, the quiet smiles, the bowed heads, the steady hands. In this way, the cruelty thrived, hidden in plain sight, nourished by the fear of neighbors who chose ignorance over truth. The valley marched on, children born, crops planted, seasons turning, while just beyond the fences, rituals continued unchecked. The unease never vanished. It lingered in glances, in half-finished sentences, in the way no one lingered near the Sheldon fields after dusk. But unease was not action, and silence was the strongest shield the family ever possessed. For nearly a century, the Sheldon farm kept its silence, its cruelty hidden beneath weathered wood and fertile soil. Generations of neighbors came and went, their unease passed down like an old superstition, until even fear became part of the landscape. Then came the storm. It struck one summer night with a violence that seemed unnatural, as if the sky itself had grown tired of silence. Rain fell in sheets, tearing through the valley, lightning splitting the darkness, thunder shaking the earth until foundations cracked. The Sheldon farmhouse, already sagging under years of neglect, shuddered under the weight of the storm. Fields flooded, soil shifted, and trees ripped from their roots. By morning, the land no longer looked the same. The storm uncovered what human eyes had avoided for decades. Along the edge of the farmhouse, near the barn where screams once seeped into the night, the ground collapsed into a shallow sinkhole. At first, it appeared nothing more than a hole carved by rain. But as the soil slid away, shapes began to emerge. Neighbors gathered cautiously, drawn by curiosity they could not resist. The first to step closer thought he saw stones or roots tangled in the dirt. But when the mud was cleared, the truth surfaced. It was a skull, pale and broken, with holes drilled into its crown in precise geometries, as though it had been made into a diagram. Authorities were summoned, though the valley had long learned not to speak the family's name too loudly. What followed was not the discovery of a simple grave, but the unearthing of an archive of cruelty hidden for generations. Beneath the soil lay skeletons, not buried with dignity but arranged in patterns, their bones aligned in ways that echoed the markings carved into the chamber walls below. Some skulls bore symmetrical holes carefully drilled as if for study. Others had their jaws pried open, teeth broken, tongues long gone, but the iron clamps that had once held them still clinging to bone. The remains of children were found shackled in positions too unnatural to be mistaken for rest. Arms bent backward, ribs crushed, small spines forced into arches as if to mirror the shapes of symbols long forgotten. As investigators dug deeper, the earth yielded more horrors. Skeletons were layered, not dumped but organized, each arrangement deliberate. A row of rib cages was found lined against the stone wall of the chamber's foundation, as if displayed. Tiny finger bones were gathered in jars, sealed shut, preserved long after flesh had decayed. Some remains were wrapped in cloth that had rotted away, leaving behind fragments that still bore stains darkened with time. It was not a burial ground. It was a ledger made of bodies, each one a record of ritual, each one a testament to the doctrine passed from father to son. The discovery shook even hardened authorities. Men who had seen war and crime turned pale, their hands trembling as they lifted bones from the soil. They spoke in hushed voices, unable to explain what they saw. The arrangement of remains defied ordinary violence. This was not the chaos of murder. It was order, method, ritual. It was cruelty elevated into structure, an archive of pain left hidden until the storm forced it into daylight. History gasped, for what emerged from the earth was not only evidence of death but of generations who had lived and suffered without record, their lives erased until only their broken bones told the story. News spread quickly. The valley that had whispered for so long could no longer keep silent. Reporters descended, cameras flashing against the farmhouse's weathered boards. Questions shouted that no one could answer. How could a family live among others year after year while carrying out horrors so deliberately? How could neighbors smell the smoke, hear the screams, see the lights, and do nothing? Silence itself became part of the crime, a shield that had protected the Sheldons while they built their archive of cruelty on the earth. Forensic teams mapped the remains, tracing the symbols etched into bone, the precision of holes drilled into skulls, the repeated patterns in which children were bound. Experts called it ritual, though no religion in the world claimed it. Others called it science twisted into cruelty, experiments masquerading as doctrine. Whatever the name, it revealed a truth almost too heavy to bear. The Sheldons had not lived outside of time by accident. They had built their own time, their own order, their own history, written not in paper but in flesh. The farmhouse itself became part of the investigation. Beneath its floorboards, the chamber was uncovered, its carving still sharp, its shelves lined with jars clouded with decay. The ledgers were found too, pages of neat handwriting recording each ritual with chilling clarity. Dates, times, methods, outcomes, all preserved as if cruelty were not horror but heritage. The writings confirmed what the bones already showed. The family had spent generations perfecting the art of torment, hiding it beneath the mask of piety and normalcy. For those who had lived near the farm, the revelation was almost unbearable. The stories they had dismissed, the unease they had buried, the whispers they had silenced, all had been true. Their silence had allowed the doctrine to thrive, and now the earth itself accused them with the bodies of children who had never been named. The storm had stripped away not just soil but denial, exposing what the valley had chosen for a century not to see. What lay in the ground was not only a crime scene but a warning. The archive of bones revealed how evil does not always roar or demand attention. Sometimes it works patiently, quietly, methodically, behind doors that seem ordinary, in families that seem respectable. It hides behind smiles, behind prayers, behind silence, and if no one speaks, if no one dares to look too closely, it grows roots deep enough to last for generations. Until the day the earth itself decides it can no longer keep the secret. The discovery of the Sheldon chamber did not stay confined to the valley. Once the bones were lifted from the soil and the ledgers revealed, the story spread across the nation like a sickness carried on the wind. Newspapers printed the images of skulls drilled with holes, of tiny shackles rusted with age, of ledgers written in steady hands cataloging deaths like seasons. The public recoiled, yet they could not look away. The horror was not only in the cruelty itself, but in how long it had been allowed to grow in silence, hidden in plain sight while neighbors lived within earshot of screams. Lawmakers struggled to find words strong enough to match what had been unearthed. What haunted them most was not just the archive of pain, but the absence of record. Generations of Sheldon children had been born without names, lived without acknowledgement, and died without recognition. Their existence was erased before it could ever be confirmed. It became clear that the crime was not only the torture and killing, but the system of silence that had made it possible. Without records, there were no questions. Without names, there could be no outrage. These were lives stolen not only from the world, but from memory itself. The nation responded with changes meant to guard against such erasure ever again. Laws were drafted that required every birth to be registered, every child to be accounted for, no matter how remote or isolated the family. Midwives and doctors were given new authority to report unrecorded children, and the absence of a birth certificate became grounds for investigation. Rural isolation, once treated as a matter of privacy, came under sharper watch. The state declared that no family could exist in silence outside its reach, for silence had now been proven capable of breeding monstrosity. Child welfare systems, weak and inconsistent before, were strengthened with urgency. Social workers were trained to look not only for bruises or scars, but for absences. The children who were never seen in schoolyards, never counted in classrooms, never mentioned beyond their own homes. What had happened on the Sheldon farm proved that invisibility was its own form of abuse, one that could hide greater horrors than anyone dared imagine. The legacy of unmarked lives forced the nation to confront how easily suffering could be erased when no one asked who was missing. At the edge of the Sheldon land, where the chamber's mouth gaped open like a wound, a memorial was built. The townspeople who once turned their faces away gathered as stone was laid, not in celebration but in penance. The memorial bore no individual names. It could not, for none had ever been recorded. Instead, its surface carried words etched into granite. For the lives that passed unseen, for the voices smothered in silence, for the children never named. Visitors left flowers at its base, their stems drying in the wind, their petals scattered across the soil that had once hidden so much pain. The valley that had whispered in fear now stood forced to remember. Its silence broken not by choice but by revelation. And yet even with laws changed and stone raised, the truth lingered heavily. No legal document, no memorial, no speech in the halls of power could restore the unmarked lives. Their childhoods had been consumed in rituals no one dared speak of in detail, their bodies broken and arranged as symbols in a doctrine too cruel to comprehend. They had never been allowed to laugh freely, to play in fields, to be held in safety. They had been erased at birth, and their only presence left in the world was the bone and blood unearthed by a storm. The nation promised it would never allow such silence again, but the soil of the farm remained a reminder that promises come after the damage is done, that remembrance cannot undo erasure. The legacy of unmarked lives haunted not only the valley but the country itself, a wound carved into history that no amount of stone or law could truly close. In the end, the Sheldons were not monsters from myth or creatures of nightmare, but ordinary people who carried out extraordinary cruelty beneath the mask of normal life. They walked among their neighbors with steady hands, calm smiles, and polite words. They bowed their heads in prayer, traded fairly at markets, and tipped their hats to passing strangers. To the outside world, they looked no different from any other farming family. Yet behind their doors, within their walls, and beneath their floors, they built a system of ritualized suffering that lasted for generations. It was not rage that drove them, nor madness, but patience. An evil refined with care, carried out with order, and passed down as if it were inheritance. The most chilling truth was not that such cruelty had occurred, but how it survived. It did not thrive in chaos or open violence, but in silence. Each act was hidden beneath ordinary gestures, each ritual shielded by the appearance of respectability. The Sheldons proved how violence can grow when concealed inside the everyday, when neighbors choose not to question, when society allows gaps in its watch. Behind the ordinary walls of a farmhouse, family became factory, love became weakness, and children became subjects for experiments of torment. Evil did not roar in that place, it whispered, and no one dared listen closely enough to hear. Their legacy was a warning etched into history. That darkness does not always announce itself with blood on its hands or fire in its eyes. Sometimes it wears clean clothes and speaks gently. Sometimes it is disguised as privacy or tradition or faith. The Sheldons lived not as beasts, but as men who believed their cruelty was justified, who measured pain like harvests and recorded suffering as if it were progress. They showed how easily ordinary life can be twisted when no one looks too closely, and how evil passed from father to son can become as natural as soil tilled in spring. The memorial raised on their land stands as a stone reminder of what silence cost. Visitors come and lower their heads, reading the words carved into granite, leaving flowers that wilt in the wind. Yet even stone feels inadequate, for no monument can give names to children who never had them, or restore the voices smothered before they could cry. The soil holds the memory more clearly than stone ever could, soaked in the evidence of lives erased by a family who treated cruelty as devotion. The story endures because it forces a question that cannot be answered easily. If such horror could last for a century behind ordinary walls, what other cruelties remain hidden in silence today? How many lives vanish unnoticed, not in fields or chambers, but in homes where neighbors prefer not to ask questions? Evil does not need power to thrive, it only needs indifference. The Sheldons proved that evil waits patiently, growing stronger in the spaces where no one dares to speak. In the end, their story is not only about a family, but about the silence that sheltered them. It shows that the greatest danger lies not always in monstrous acts themselves, but in how easily those acts can hide in plain sight. And so the question lingers like a shadow. What do you think? Could this happen again?